I haven't written down what I'm going to say, so this won't be quite as well scripted, unfortunately. I'll have to make it up as I go along. I think the important thing to say about this is that the context I see is climate change, is environmental concerns. That's really my biggest drive. I think it's, along with the social side of things, it's the biggest driver of the practice, and I am sort of unashamedly saying this is what I'm focusing on here. You can't quite tell, but the context I am talking about is this business of the climate breakdown, climate change, resources, and some other stuff. Right, so perspective. The perspective here is useful. Numbers are very misleading, but it's quite nice to get a sense of scale. We need to be at about 10%. If you're trying to be energy efficient in your buildings, we don't need to be zero anything. We need to be about 10%, and 10% is roughly what Passive House is. And this is about being equitable across the world, so we need to if for Britain it's 10%. You can say a lot of things about housing, and I'm not sufficiently expert about them. These are all car-free. They are integrated with public transport. We have amenities on hand, so you don't have to drive to get to them. And people are growing their own food in some cases. So there's a lot else to climate change and housing than just energy and so on and so forth. I won't do too many graphs, I promise, but this one is useful. We are now designing most of our stuff to this. And the point is, it is a tenth of that in terms of energy. And I'll just say it again, we have got to ramp this right down in terms of energy. It's getting really serious. And we're doing absolutely the best we can to do that. This is a bit random, but the point of this is that when you look into it, what you realize is what architects said was going to happen and what actually happens are two completely different things. And when we study buildings for real, we have a whole thing called HabLab where we look at what's happening in reality with buildings. It's not the same thing as we said to clients, and we're trying to change what we do. So this is an example of a private house, which is a passive house. It operates on less than 10% of a normal house. We've closed that performance gap that we're talking about, all the gaps that are normally constructed in. The whole thing is built to have very low embodied energy, which is roughly a third of the whole footprint, and where you can't tell, but there's a whole roof of renewables on there trying to make the energy we do need used. But that was a sort of nice big posh house, which is lovely if you've got a bit of money. We're trying to drive this towards social housing, so the important thing to say is that we're now contracted for well over 200 social housing units, which are passive house. They're fixed price passive house, so very, very low energy, no fuel poverty. You can't have fuel poverty on a tenth of what would be normal. Oh, bugger. Right, and the thing about this is it's also about renovation. It's also about refurbishment. This, I'm hoping, will be our first scaled-up Enefit project, which is a passive house refurbishment, and that is a guide that I wrote trying to develop a more holistic view on what we should do with buildings, existing buildings. When you're talking about resources, we're trying to use less. This is, again, the sense of scale. We need to use about a third of the stuff we normally use to build buildings. How can you do that? You can build less houses, but that doesn't necessarily help us, so we can use natural materials. That's one way of doing it. That's a house made out of all local timber. That's CLT, which I suspect John will talk about. It doesn't have to be timber. These are buildings. This is a house for my mother, which was all built out of earth and straw. The whole house is earth and straw and sheep's wool. There's a straw bale house at the top, and on the right, that is a big urban building in Germany, which is all timber and earth. So it doesn't have to be cute little sheds, we need the clients for that sort of stuff, to be honest. So again, yes, local materials, natural materials, also waste materials. We now can build buildings. This was a building which didn't happen in the end where the whole thing was waste materials, right? There were issues with toxicity, but basically we can do the whole thing with waste materials. No, but you can't use certain things, right? Because you have to get kind of clarification about what their status is. Rural Studio are probably the best people at the top here. This was the only bit left of was going to be a speculative bit. But how do we build these houses? How do we look into the future? That's the bit that matters, I think. This idea of private sufficiency, much more modest, but public luxury. We spend the luxury on the public realm, and the houses get a little bit tighter. I don't mind that houses are small. I think it's okay as long as they're good houses, personally. But I know that's not always popular. You can't read some of this, I'm sorry. Then if you're into pollution and health, then you think it's a really big deal. Most people don't read about it, therefore they don't think it's an issue. But the more you read about it, the worse it gets. That housing is actually Gaia housing that I was involved in years ago, but it was asthma-free housing, and it was looking at all the reasons that children get asthma. It's to do with toxicity in materials. It's also to do with managing moisture. So what we're trying to do is make sure that we keep a balanced moisture, humidity level in the house. And there are lots of ways of doing that, not just ventilation, because we're getting a lot of mold. The next big thing is going to be ventilation, and we need to watch that. Now that we've made all these nice warm airtight houses, we're going to see that more and more and more. And the other thing is that we're still getting some basic things wrong. We've still got houses that have been insulated which are too cold. We've got houses which are getting too hot. I've done a lot of research on overheating. Red is bad, basically, and that's 26 overheating low-energy houses, so it's a thing. And we need to think about the way we provide heat. This, again, is my mum's house, where it's all radiant heating. The air is cool, but the warmth is radiant, and it means you can spend a lot less money on energy because you're providing it efficiently. Lastly, little bits about procurement. It's a little bit more unstructured, this. The point is, it's what everybody else has said. We need to engage with people much, much more than we're doing. We're not experts. We're sort of connecting people together. This is a community building up in Lewis, which was for a archive. This is how you build. I haven't got time to tell you the stories of that, but this is my mother's house being built by children, slave labour, child labour. It's always good. They were happy. They were happy. Straw bale building. But the point is that we can build things, and Angela will probably talk about this. We can build things in a lot of different ways. We don't need to get builders in every time to do things. And sometimes if it's your home, you're more motivated to do it properly. It's my experience. I grew up in rented houses all my life, and despite what's been said, I actually was always very driven to own a house because I wanted to do a really green house. I didn't want to take someone else's house. So this is a bow group and that we set up in Dunblane to build our own homes, and they were relatively green homes, but I think John's is slightly more photogenic. But it doesn't have to be just rural. This is a bow group and a whole urban scale set of houses built in Germany, which were all, there's no developer. The people get together and they act as their own developers, and there are enormous benefits from doing that. I didn't think there'd be any gaps in my talk. I just want to say this. We now can build houses which use more or less no fossil fuel. We can provide all of that from renewables. We can use only waste or renewable materials. It doesn't need to be any embodied energy or very low. They can be completely comfortable, healthy, cause no pollution. That's inherently fairer, and we can do things in a much more convivial way, much nicer way to procure buildings.